One of the speakers that's going to be looking at advertising and taking a critical eye to it is Scott Rafer, who, though American, is well known in European circles and spends a lot of time there and does a lot of business over there. And we had requests for him. And he runs a social media advertising network, and he's going to be diving into what are the actual economics around that and why you won't make as much money as you may hope you will. So I think that talk in particular will tie in directly to what Tim was just saying.
We also have a very healthy keynote lineup that includes some of the top investors in Web 2 startups across Europe. And I think this is where Tim's getting to about some of the concerns about the Web 2 market being primarily advertising supported. We're going to spend some time on stage with people like Martin Varsavsky, Yossi Vardi, Saul Klein, Tariq Karim, talking about where they want to put their money, where they see the most interesting startups coming, and what they think really has legs in this market. And I think what you'll be able to see at Web 2 Expo Europe is a conversation between somebody like Tim, who's thinking about, and sort of setting trends globally. We've got some of the top investors in Europe on the keynote stage, and that you'll be talking with both Martin Varsavsky and Yossi Vardi, and we'll also have Saul Klein there talking about where they want to be investing and what they see as the sectors and the trends that are attracting them.
So I said, I talked about explicit and implicit, and that being one of the big trends. There's going to be new sources of data. And the second thing, as I said, is there's going to be new business models besides advertising. And I think a lot of those are going to be commerce-based. And that doesn't just include, sort of an obvious e-commerce. It might be, for example, when you look at the cloud computing platform, the transaction might be, I'm buying some computation, or I'm buying some storage online. In the case of what we see with the iPhone App Store, increasingly people are getting used to the idea of paying for applications. And I think there's going to be a whole new explosion, even on the web, of e-commerce around applications rather than just the sort of idea that advertising is the only model. So those are just a few thoughts, for us all to chew on.
I think I'll just sort of flesh out from a program standpoint the different levels that we'll be kind of offering here. So on the highest level, again, our keynotes this year are really dominated by the investment sector and people who are making it their jobs to look across the European layer of innovation and pull out specific stuff that they're interested in. We do our keynotes with a seated conversation to start, and then we follow up with sort of short bits. And in that section, we'll be getting some of the people who are not so much investing, but are really building interesting things, thinking about the web and where it's going, and are going to just talk about the trends and the work that they're doing. So people like Julian Bleeker, Lisa Reichelt, who coined the term ambient intimacy, which people are using to explain Twitter these days. Ben Hammersley from The Guardian, who's a fantastic speaker. Sue Charman, Patrick McDevitt from TeleAtlas talking about geodata. So we really want the event to both look at sort of the big picture and also from the perspective of someone who is building a Web 2 app, marketing a Web 2 app, integrating design principles with their development, all the different aspects. It's really an event for them to both see the big picture and the more day-to-day trends all at one place.
When I think about the things that are going to be transformative in the next few years, that will really change the game, change the model, they have to do with first of all, with the advent of Web 2.0 applications that are driven primarily by devices. So when when your phone reports your location, you don't have to do anything. The device is just automatically participating for you. Your GPS in your car, reports the trace of where you've been. And maybe it lets increasingly gets more internet savvy and lets you start finding offers and interesting things on your route. How do you mine and use that data? And so a corresponding piece of that, of course, is a challenge for Web 2.0 to make it to 3.0 is to make sure that the devices of the future are open. And this is why things like Google's Android and Open Handset Alliance project are really important, because Google knows that if the web does not make it onto the phone as a primary application delivery platform, if we have these closed phone application delivery platforms, a lot of the excitement and interest and power that we've seen in the web is going to go away. So I think that's, so in some sense, the challenge and the opportunity is to make a device web that looks like the World Wide Web that's lived on computers. I guess I have to say, there are already so many people gathering data about us that we don't know about and don't think about. And I think the cat is out of the bag on privacy and personal data. So the real challenge for companies, and I really think that the essence of delivering value in a Web 2.0 era depends on having access to private data. And therefore, what we really have to do is we have to say, what's the deal? What's the transaction? What makes it worth my while to give up that privacy? And companies that create value with that data for the consumer and provider of that data will be okay. Companies that abuse that data to provide more value for themselves are going to be in trouble. Or for example, if they take data from consumers and get their money from advertisers, the real tricky balance is, how do you create an ecosystem where the consumer is willing to give up that data because of the value they get back? And I think one of the real guiding watchwords, a line we use at O'Reilly, and a guiding watchword should be for every company that's engaged in this stance, should be create more value than you capture. If you just create more value than you capture, I think you're okay on privacy, because, again, you have to safeguard people's individual data. But the fact is, building applications against aggregate data is the whole name of the game. There's a difference. I think open source software, in some ways, actually is an enabler for private and proprietary data as a business model, right? So, the fact is, if you look at, the big challenge of Web 2.0 to the PC era model, it was that open source software was commoditizing the software business model. So someone like, Web 2.0 companies give away their software for free, and they monetize via data. So if you have an advertising business model, you're monetizing the fact that people are coming to view you, and you're effectively creating this linkage. And the better you are at that linkage, the more money you make. That requires a vast database. So that's, to me, the essence of Web 2.0. You're no longer monetizing software directly. You're monetizing this sort of data-driven service with the software and the service given away for free. And so the question really is, will that move to the device? What we see right now on the iPhone is it's closed software, and we are starting to see maybe that the proprietary software model will come back on the phone. It's certainly possible. Google, for instance, is placing a big bet that no, we really want the web models to work on the phone, and hopefully they can coexist. I am concerned about the swing back to proprietary. I think we could all really regret it. And I do think that, the second point, there will come a time, I think it's still 4 or 5 years off, where we will have a really militant open data movement that sort of has to do with sort of taking back control over data. One of the things that I have always said about Web 2.0 is that a lot of what it is ultimately gathering all this data to harness collective intelligence. And these applications in many ways make us smarter. When you're using a live streaming service, you have this ambient awareness of your friends and people you know. That makes you smarter. When you have the ability to use a search engine to look up information about anything, that makes you smarter. So but there's a lot of really big challenges facing us as a culture. And we're starting to see startups. So there's a startup in the UK called AMEE, and they're trying to basically build software for carbon markets. So Doppler, the UK-based travel service that lets you sort of have a social network with your friends where you're traveling, now reports on the carbon usage of your trip. So these two companies, and that's using, AME has built an open source framework for companies to share, sort of carbon data. That's an interesting example of doing something that's sort of tackling a real world problem, providing useful data that then can be used by other services. I think this is going to be really big, the whole idea of the carbon market. Another one, there's a whole area that I'm really, fascinated by, which is disaster relief. There's a global project, I think originally came out of Canada, but it was funded by Google.org, called Instead. I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's basically early detection of infectious diseases. And this is a great example of how do you harness crowdsourcing for a really big problem. Because it turns out that when we've eradicated diseases like smallpox, it wasn't through vaccination. It was actually through early detection and isolation. And when there's something like bird flu or SARS, they've stopped it by hearing about it really quickly. And, so what Instead figured out was that they could get, build a framework whereby user reports of the spread of infectious diseases could get, to health authorities much faster than through the normal channels. And I think that's a great example, again, of somebody. Also, there's some fabulous things, in terms of just government transparency. They work for you. Is this fabulous site that's changed the behavior of the British Parliament because it reports on everything they do, so citizens can see how people voted much more easily. It's a great line from Cory Doctorow, although he tells me he's not the first one who said it. It's just every complex system has its parasites. And there definitely are people who take advantage, and new systems often come in and they kind of look like they can all be idealistic and isn't everything wonderful. And then before long, the parasites are back. And I think there's absolutely risk to web applications, organized crime. I think that's been true for a long time. And I think, web applications have to grow immune systems. I certainly think that that's an area where I think there's some real opportunity. Startups that actually build, help companies build immune systems. I think we're going to see a collision of technologies. I mean, what's the world's greatest phone company? Nokia. Nokia has I think an enormous stake in the future of the web and can become a really, really important player. You look at, so I think, in the extent that the phone is going to drive, innovation here. I mean, I'm not sure the U.S. is at all the dominant player. It's also true that there are other areas in which we're going to be surprised, I think, by what comes out of Europe. I'm thinking about back on this thing of world serious issues. There's just some amazing work being done by the OECD on what makes what's actually the right way to measure nations' success. The old models of GDP, for example, aren't necessarily the right way for us to think about is one nation better off than another. And they've been leading the charge on this idea of how do you measure actual national happiness. And I think there's going to be some really interesting, there's some interesting perspectives that I think Europe has on non-consumer culture. And I think we're going to see some interesting changes. So everything becoming more and more. There's going to be a swing, I think, away from the consumer side And again, there you look at a company like, again, I'm thinking about big companies here, but SAP, they really, we're doing a project between O'Reilly and SAP where we're working with them on how do they crowdsource their documentation. That's not something that Microsoft is exploring. It's SAP, for Christ's sake. They're going, hey, there's something we can do here with open source and crowdsourcing that, so figuring out how to step back a little bit and take the principles that, to be sure, were shown off first by U.S.-based consumer startups. Now let's see through those and understand where could we apply those principles in other areas. I think 3D is really important, but I don't think it's virtual world in the way that we, the second lifestyle virtual world. The thing that I see is it's becoming increasingly the case that companies are building 3D models of the real world. If you look at what Google and Microsoft are doing with sort of street view photography, and then how hard is it to build a 3D model once you actually have the photographs? We're finding that you can make a 3D model with as few as 3 photographs. And what Microsoft did with PhotoSense really showed the power of that. And I think, and I was talking with Autodesk, and it's interesting, Autodesk, a U.S. company, but they actually have only about 30% of their revenues inside the U.S. now. And, a lot of the really interesting work in architecture, for example, coming out of Europe, is a whole new field of computational architecture. As they can design more and more flexible materials, start being able to sort of compute new building shapes, and then you have problems like, well, what's actually the most efficient shape? This is another end of Web 2.0, because here you're actually, in many cases, going back to this idea of 3D modeling, talking with the CEO of Autodesk, one of the things he said is our workflow is moving from one in which somebody sits down at a computer and designs something, which is then, built, to one in which we sample the world, and then we modify that, and then build it. So there's a really interesting sort of set of things that are happening around 3D, in which when you start thinking about, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the device as a sensor. The camera is a sensor. Your camera is going to increasingly start, and again, particularly as the phone becomes the camera, it will always report the location of every photo. Effectively, we're going to build a really rich 3D model of the real world. The virtual world sort of hung off that. I was just looking, I was at a large financial company, and they were showing a 3D world that's based on called Quack, QUAQ, and it's basically virtual worlds for business collaboration. Where we're going to encounter 3D modeling much more, is going to be, just an increasing richness of our, of our applications on the phone. You're looking for an address. Well, here's the picture, potentially the 3D model of the building.
And that's one of the things that TeleAtlas's CTO, Pat McDevitt, will be able to talk about. TeleAtlas was just purchased by TomTom. They're the second largest geodata provider, and they've been making huge infrastructure plays in gathering 3D data along with the traditional street map data.
And on a more sort of commercial, practical level, we do talk at the conference about the potential for virtual worlds, both from a design perspective. How do you understand how community interacts in a virtual world as opposed to, say, a Facebook community? But also from a marketing perspective. We do have a strong business community at this event, and one of the things they're looking at is as other forms of marketing become less and less effective and you're moving your money into different areas, is there a potential to use virtual worlds for marketing purposes? So there'll be a pretty thorough discussion of that led by Matthias Mischke, who runs Stardoll.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I mean, Stardoll, hugely successful company, building special purpose virtual worlds. Absolutely. I mean, I guess I always talk about the real long-term trend, and I see virtual reality moving towards augmented reality. But Jen is absolutely right that there's sort of a whole game layer kind of experience that something like Stardoll provides, and really computer gaming in general as a kind of virtual world that I think is huge.
I think people have started to really see social networks as this, piece that sits between what we used to think of as the gaming world and the online, sort of traditional online community world, where a lot of the dynamics cross over both directions, and there's a lot of sort of fertile ideas for development in those worlds.
I do think if you think about how people spend their time, you're right. There are the idea of an immersive virtual world that consumes your entertainment time. I think is absolutely real. People will go into that as a potential replacement for, say, reading a book or going to a movie, but I think that there's also this sort of really powerful aspect where there's a trend away from that towards simplicity. You think about the rise of something like Twitter. It's a minimal interface, and and it's accessible from anywhere. People do it on their laptop. They do it on their phone. They can interface with it for all kinds of, and it's ambient. Ambient future is a big part of it. So the question for the long term is, what can you take from virtual world experience and take it into the ambient experience? Certainly, this is looking out a little bit, but I think that some of the early hackers in wearable computing, they're going to be seen as, oh, well, these guys were really onto something. Because I do think that the heads-up augmented reality display is not that far off. So the virtual world will be, overlaid on the real world, and I expect to see startups coming in that direction as well. But as I said, right now, I think it is still probably, more immersive gaming. On the one hand, would be the pushing into that end of virtual, and then the really minimalist ambient stuff on the other end.
We do have a talk also by Timo Arnal that's titled Web in the World in our design track, where he talks about, the same way that the web is extending into the mobile platform, it's extending into the physical world and the various places where that's permeating and what the implications are of that.
Kind of going back to, the core idea of Web 2.0, the big collective intelligence. I do think it's again, when I think of two core ideas of Web 2.0, one is the internet as platform drives collective intelligence, but it's also how do you build cooperating applications on that platform? And so finding ways that you can build services that are consumable by other players. So for example, Zamanta, is an Estonian startup doing collaborative filtering. Challenge is, okay, can somebody who has a best-of-breed solution then say, okay, you can use us via web services in a cooperating application? Because that's really one of the interesting challenges for the future. Right now, we have a lot of people who are in this race somehow to be the winner-take-all. And I think the real opportunity is to say, how do I become part of a really powerful ecosystem where I do my piece really well, and well enough that somebody actually pays me for it, and I enable other players. Reuters is doing a really interesting thing with OpenCalais. What they realized was that they can't just be a commodity information provider, and so what they're doing with Calais is they're building a collaborative platform whereby people can add additional metadata into all the Reuters feeds so that it can be consumed more intelligently by downstream applications. So what they're really understanding is that we're moving towards an information ecosystem. It's a little bit like the old Unix pipeline, where one application hands off data to another, which does something to it, which then hands it off to another. And I think there's a lot of evolution to be done, particularly on the B2B side initially, for this kind of B2B information exchange. One of the good things about the spread of the internet everywhere is you get innovation in one market that then gets transferred to another. And for a long time the flow was happening from the U.S. to other countries, and now it's starting to happen in the other direction. And so, if you look at some of the startups in China, they've, for example, done much more with China and Korea. They've done much more with e-commerce based on virtual goods versus advertising. And now, of course, that's spreading worldwide. So there's definitely going to be changes in that way. Clearly, I think some of the internet tends to encourage, participatory, more awareness. So I think it may have a political impact in those countries. So it'll be a tug of war. I think but I have to say that there is still, at the end of the day, because there are still language differences. So the rate of transmission is still small. We don't have a single internet. We have technologically we do, but in terms of the usage, you have local language networks with their own best of breed applications. And that's actually a good thing. It's part of why we don't want a homogeneous world. And I think it's fabulous that that there's been some there are local success stories in every country, because it really makes the internet a stronger place rather than if there were a few global giants that kind of took it all everywhere. There is no question in my mind that there will be cyber wars. I mean, we have already seen them in the conflict between Russia and Georgia. There was certainly pretty strong evidence of the cyber war, but I think it's certainly possible. And again, that would be, I think, a worthwhile thing to think about. How do you make applications more robust by running them through more channels? Cyber war might try to shut down everything. But for example, a phone. We've seen in the case of natural disasters that people could use messaging when they couldn't make phone calls, so they could use Twitter when they couldn't make phone calls. And so I think one of the strengths that we want to build into our systems are multiple channels for information transfer.
There's a big aspect of this event too, which is helping translate these very, not very, but somewhat further out trends into what's happening in corporations today. So just one example is we have a talk by J.P. Rangaswamy, who's at a big bank, about how Web 2.0 has changed the way they communicate within that organization. And that's just one of several talks that are on a little bit more of a practical level, so that you understand this event is accessible both to sort of people on the edge and people in the middle who are bringing these practices into an organization and figuring out how it works in more traditional business. So there, again, multiple levels for this event. I also wanted to call out, since there's been a lot of interest from the community in putting women on our stages, that we have quite a few female speakers at the event, and it's something we have encouraged and supported, and we'll try to do an event for women, a networking event for women one evening at the event as well. But other than that, I think we've given you a good sense of the sort of high-level topics that'll be covered at the event. Perhaps.
Yeah, can I follow up on the corporate side?
Yes, please.
One comment, Jen. And it's just a really, I think, interesting point. Corporations have enormous Web 2.0 assets that they're not using. If you mistakenly think that Web 2.0 is about these sort of lightweight consumer apps that are fueled by advertising, you may not understand why corporations are in such a big position with Web 2.0. But if you think about a big multinational, they have enormous databases. They have enormous customer lists. And these things, if the definition of a Web 2.0 app is an application that gets better the more people use it, these guys are in an amazing position. And so companies, first, they're starting with, say, let's deploy blogs and wikis or whatever internally, and that's great. But the next thing for them to wake up to, and I see companies starting to do this, is, we have all this customer data. And, I think that there are areas like supply chain management or CRM that are really ripe to be reinvented using Web 2.0 principles. And I think we're going to see a lot of innovation on the enterprise side of Web 2.0 in the next in the next few years. In fact, if I were to make a prediction, we're going to see, kind of a bit of a crash and burn for many consumer Web 2.0 companies, at the same time as we have some hidden companies that nobody has kind of thought of as Web 2.0 companies emerging on the scene with deep, rich, fully formed business models. I just spent some time today with a company whose motto is stealth till IPO. They've been profitable since 2002. They're building an enormous business with deep technology and enormous databases. And I can't tell you what they do, but it's both has an enterprise and a consumer side, but primarily a B2B play that Web 2.0 to the core. And I think there's going to be a lot of these companies that are suddenly going to emerge and surprise the world. So I'm actually pretty bullish about where we're going, because the trends of Web 2.0 are every application is becoming networked and having a cloud component. Every application is becoming more data-driven. And the companies that supply tools for understanding and managing data, the companies that have the data and are building big, useful databases and figuring out how to repurpose it, the companies that are building applications against that, all have a really strong future. We're going to have, I think, some real surprises in the next few years.
I'll add also that the companies that are able to see connections across what used to be silos have an advantage. For example, Tim's talking about analytics. If you use analytics from your website to feed back into the evolution of your user experience, you have an advantage in terms of being able to build something that people like Google is a master of this, but we're trying to help companies understand the set of data that they have and how they can feed that back to improve their business. There's a company called Nitobi who'll be talking about that in our design user experience track. I guess just the final note would be that it's an interesting day to be having a conference call on this with the financial markets where they are, and that we're hoping by the time we get to Europe we'll have a little bit more clarity on this, but it seems like we'll have a keen eye on where Web 2.0 investments are, but what we're hoping to see is that the innovation in this market protects it somewhat from what's going on in the larger markets, and the ethos of transparency that you see throughout the Web 2 world is sort of a new direction that the financial markets can take to get themselves out of the mess that they're in.